We have nicknamed you Cowboy Ohtani. This is something, it kind of came to us right away. We're like, listen, Oklahoma State player, hits towering home runs, nasty stuff pitching. Do we have your thoughts? Can we get a grade on the scale of 1 to 10? Do we have to workshop this, Nolan?
I don't hate it. I don't hate it at all. I'm not a huge nickname guy, but I mean, that one's pretty sweet, so we'll take it.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, and a special guest on today's show, Binghamton Rumble Pony, Mets two-way prospect, Nolan McLean. Nolan, thanks for joining us. How are you, man?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we got to get right to it. You probably don't know this, but you've become kind of a cult figure on this show since you've been drafted. With your success pitching, ability to hit, the towering home runs, the fact that when you got drafted by the Mets, they were very down to let you to continue to do both, not have to go to just pitching or just hitting. We have nicknamed you Cowboy Ohtani. This is something, it kind of came to us right away. We're like, listen, Oklahoma State player, hits towering home runs, nasty stuff pitching. Do we have your thoughts? Can we get a grade on the scale of 1 to 10? Do we have to workshop this, Nolan?
I don't hate it. I don't hate it at all. I'm not a huge nickname guy, but I mean, that one's pretty sweet, so we'll take it. Anytime you can be compared to Ohtani, I guess it's pretty all right. So
obviously, being a two-way player is not exactly commonplace yet in pro ball. Prior to the draft, did you have conversations with teams and specifically the Mets about your desire to do both professionally?
Yeah, I mean, plenty of teams wanted me to just pitch. There was a few teams who wanted me to just hit, but I still wanted to pursue doing both and just kind of see where it took me for as long as I could. And the Mets made it pretty obvious that they were really interested in it, and it ended up working out on draft day that they got to pick me, and it's been really fun ever since.
So I know you initially played quarterback in high school, and you initially planned to do both at Oklahoma State. What was that decision like when it was time to just branch off all into baseball, especially the success you had at quarterback in high school?
Yeah, I mean, I was on a team my freshman year, and then that freshman summer, obviously I was going to be playing a lot of baseball, and then with spring practice for football and spring games for baseball, I wasn't able to get around to both a whole lot. So I sat down with the quarterbacks coach and just told him to be honest with me if I was going to be able to get much of a chance not being around. And I kind of knew the answer already. And he said it'd be really hard for me to work in some starter reps if I'm not around the team a whole lot and really learning the system that they had in place with some older guys. So after that, I was like, okay, I think I'll just really pursue my passion for baseball and see where this can take me.
So we're coming up on a year since the Mets drafted you. Talk through draft day. Where were you? Was it a party? And talk through the moment when you actually got the call from the Mets that they were taking you in the third round.
Yeah. So, I mean, I watched the full first day. Knew a lot of the guys getting picked on those days, or that day, obviously. A lot of people I've grown up with and grown around and been some teammates with. And then that second day, it was pretty early, and it wasn't a big party. Just me, my family, and a few of our close loved ones. And it was I got the phone call, and I was just, once I hung up, my parents obviously knew because my facial expressions changed quite a bit that I was that I had gotten drafted. And I told them it was going to be the Mets, but it would have been probably 4 picks prior that I knew, and I was like, the Mets are going to be coming up soon. They're going to pick me. And so we got to watch it, and it was a really special moment for me and my family.
Nolan, how was your first spring training and adjusting not only to professional baseball, but the fact that on top of it, you're converting to being a starting pitcher and you're still a hitter in all of this?
Yeah, it was a lot of trial and error, and I think it still will be, just because it's so different, and it's hard to do. It really is, for a time management and a body management thing. So for a while in spring training, I was really focusing on building up the arm and protecting my arm and being able to really transition into a starter coming into the full season. And then later in spring training, I started working in some at bats, and then once I got shipped out to Brooklyn, then it was full go from there.
The Mets have a history of converting college relievers to pro starters, whether that's Tyler McGill, Christian Scott, your teammate Tyler Stewart, and now yourself. What's been the biggest adjustment for you in the transition? And have you made any changes to your pitch mix?
I'd say the biggest adjustment is probably just learning how to pitch deeper into games and not necessarily just go try to blow doors in the first inning and not have much left for the second through fifth to sixth and seventh inning. And being able to get guys out multiple times in an order, I think, is something I've kind of had to learn how to do and still learning how to do. And some days are better than others, obviously. But I think that kind of finding, like, I call it like the cruising altitude on what my perceived effort needs to be from a throwing standpoint. That's whether it's a velocity thing or just kind of how hard I feel I'm throwing to still be able to go longer into games, I think is going to be the biggest adjustment for me.
In following what you're doing offensively, what really stands out, what's impressive is just the elite batted ball data. Now that you've, made the jump already to AA ball up in Binghamton, what else have you been working on from an offensive standpoint?
I think the biggest thing for me is cleaning up some of the end zone swing and miss. Obviously, the power's there. I don't chase a whole lot. And I can hit the ball to all fields. So if I can just swing and miss a little bit less, then obviously the numbers will take off even more than they do.
Some will talk about a two-way player being a bit of a novelty act. How confident are you that you can maintain this heading into your major league career? Ohtani is the only one to really have done it in a long time, but he's not going to be the last one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely something I can do. Now, obviously, there's some things going through the minor leagues you have to worry about, but I mean, just like if one develops faster than the other, I don't necessarily want to be kept down because of one or the other. But I definitely think I can do both in the big leagues, and hopefully I continue to get the chance to do that.
Nolan, what's the biggest, adjustment you've had to make, or just what you've noticed overall going from high A ball up to Binghamton with both the pitchers and the guys that you face on the mound?
I'd say pitching wise, you got to execute just a little bit better. I mean, guys still chase and hit is still hard. And luckily I know that. So I'm not trying to overcomplicate things when I get out there. I'm just trying to fill up the zone with my best stuff and trust my stuff going over the plate. I don't try to get too cute with it and try to nibble. So, but you do have to execute because some of these hitters are really, really talented and really good at getting to certain pitches. I'd say the scouting report matters a lot more in AA than it did in high A. And same thing from a hitting side. You got to be ready to go from pitch one because that might be the only pitch you get. I mean, when you're facing some of these other prospects, like you miss your pitch and you're going to be behind the whole time and might get something even nastier later in the at-bat.
We've obviously spent a bunch of time in this interview talking about you, and I wanted to give you the chance to talk about somebody else. So one of your former college teammates is going to be in the MLB Draft this year and is looking like a first-round pick. I've even heard the Mets have some interest. Give us a little bit about Carson Benge.
Oh, man. Me and Carson were really, really tight at Oklahoma State. Kind of tried to take him under my wing. He got hurt his freshman year just with Tommy John surgery and him bouncing back from that. We always knew he could throw. We always knew he could hit. He can do pretty much anything on the baseball field, and hopefully he's wanting to continue to do both because I think he's one of the most talented players in the draft. From both sides of the ball, his athleticism is really good, and he lets it play. He just goes out there and lets it happen. Doesn't really overthink anything. So I think it'd be awesome if the Mets could end up picking him up.
Our listeners know him as Cowboy Ohtani, Nolan McLean. Man, we've loved watching you play in just a short time in the Mets system, coming with a ton of success from college ball that has translated really quickly, man. Thank you for the time, and best of luck the rest of the season in Binghamton.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
A huge thank you to Cowboy Ohtani, Nolan McLean, Joe. Great to talk to him. Obviously, one of the most interesting players in the Mets system, and it's been really impressive to watch him have success both as a hitter and as a pitcher. And as we noted, Joe, converting to a starting pitcher, even more on his plate this year.
That is something I think is almost taken for granted, how much work that has to go into showing up at your first your professional spring training and having to learn to go from reliever to starter while also learning professional hitting instruction. So it's a credit to Nolan that he's able to kind of take all information in and be able to produce on the field. Now at the AA level, it's been a bit of an adjustment for him. The numbers certainly aren't there on the surface, but clearly one of the most exciting and definitely most unique prospects that the Mets have.
You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. Joe, let's jump into the week that was, because it was a good one. And we said it before it all started. The Mets needed to have a big week. They took care of business. They swept the Nationals. They got the split with arguably the best team in baseball in the Philadelphia Phillies in the London series, the 2-game series. Let's start with the Nationals, Joe. I think the story was the Mets scored runs, right? It's as simple as that. 8, 6, and 9 runs in the wins. And the first 2 games, somewhat close, 8-7 and 6-3. And then the Mets really battered Patrick Corbin, as it feels like they often do over the last couple of years, in a 9-1 win against the Nationals. I mean, this is the offense that, quite frankly, Joe, we were expecting, but it is getting a boost from some unfamiliar faces and places.
It's definitely what we were expecting. When we were doing our show before the season started, we were basically saying, yeah, the offense is fine. We're not worried about that. We're really worried about the starting rotation. And the offense has obviously been one of the myriad of issues that they've dealt with throughout the first couple months of the season. But seeing that in Washington, I think was a good sign. And not even talking just about the unfamiliar faces, which we'll get to in a second. Any day now, Francisco Alvarez is getting thrown back into the lineup. So if you want to have faith, which I'll never tell anyone how to fan, I know how everyone reacts to everything, but if the Mets can go on a run here in the next month, they can put themselves squarely in wild card conversation. And, you know, I've been talking to a couple of people about this, like where the Mets need to be at the All-Star break. And to me, I think they have to be, I go on the MLB at Bat app, I look at the wild card standings, and the Mets are one of the 3 teams. And if that's the case, then, you know, you don't have to turn towards selling. But while we navigate this next month, let's do our thing as fans and support and, you know, try to see the Mets win games. And if they don't, then, you know, we readjust and talk about what we've kind of been talking about for a couple of weeks now.
Right. I think what it comes down to, Joe, this team stays hot, and the decision is already made for David Stearns that the Mets will give it a shot this year, and then they'll kind of retool as needed, or I don't want to say rebuild, but yeah, definitely a retool in the offseason. The Mets go back to playing how they were for a large part of the season, and the decision is made for David Stearns. It's going to be a pretty jarring sale, I think. I wonder if there is something in the middle, Joe, where you do move on from pieces that you just don't think are a part of your future for the long term, but you don't completely nuke things, right? Where, hey, Luis Severino's on a 1-year deal, but we really like Severino and we think we're in it. Maybe we'll hang on to him, and we're going to talk about finding an extension with him. The Mets need a ton of pitchers next year. Let's not forget this, right? Or the same could be said with Pete Alonso, but maybe there are some easier decisions to be made there where, hey, we're willing to pay off some of Jeff McNeil's money. We don't think he's a part of this future. There might be some relievers that we think they're kind of flash in the pan, or we don't have a ton of team control left. We might move on from them. So it's going to be really, really interesting. And boy, for this conversation to remain the way it was, they needed that split with the Phillies, which it felt like the exclamation point was at the very, very end of the game with Luis Torrens, Joe, who the Mets have gotten nothing from the catcher position since Francisco Alvarez went down. And since acquiring Torrens, he's had a multi-home run game. He's thrown players out trying to steal bases. There just seems to be this little extra edge with him as the backup catcher now. How do you think this plays out long term?
I mean, the Mets have to make a decision. So I talked about Francisco Alvarez just a couple minutes ago coming back into the lineup. And with Francisco Alvarez coming back, that means somebody's got to go. I don't think the Mets are in a position to be carrying 3 catchers at this time. So that means either Torrens or Tomas Nido will have to go. Neither have minor league options, so you can't just send one to AAA and worry about it later. They will have to designate one of them for assignment. And based on playing time and certainly performance, and Steve Cohen in his press conference even shouting out Torrens and talking about how he gave up $100,000 to get him, something tells me Louis Torrens is probably going to be the backup catcher when Alvarez returns. And the key on the Tomas Nido side of things, because of service time, when the Mets designate him for assignment, he can reject an outright assignment to AAA if he clears waivers and go to free agency regardless. So it is certainly looking more and more likely that we are in the last days of Tomas Nido in the Mets organization.
It makes you wonder, how much would you pay for a couple of wins? I mean, the argument right now, Joe, Torrens had a 2-home run game that basically, sprung that win. And the double play to end the London series was just a marvelous play where pretty dirty slide at the end of it, banged him up.
By a catcher, by the way. Pretty weird.
Yeah, I know people go back and forth. You play 100 miles an hour. You try to break up the double play. I mean, if you freeze frame it, he's not even starting the slide when Torrens is launching to make the throw. So probably a longer conversation for maybe a different platform. But it's funny you bring up the $100,000 because I think it's a well spent dollars at this point, especially if the Mets build off this week where, listen, they don't necessarily have to go 4-1, but you got to play above 500 baseball. And you kind of hinted at this, Joe. It's almost hilarious how bad the final wild card standings are right now in the National League. I did not think the Mets were hovering around it, and they are very much hovering around it.
I mean, we talk on air and off air about how tough this season has been, and certainly not discrediting what fans on Twitter have to say, but you would think this is like the worst season in all of Mets history based on some of the reactions. And they're still, 3.5 now? I don't even know what happened on Monday.
Yeah,
but
3.5.
3.5 out of the final wild card. So that just shows where the state of the National League is. But that's, to me, even more of a reason that if I am going to make a decision to not sell things a month from now, because the Mets could be the epicenter of the trade deadline in a seller's market, which is a huge, potential opportunity for them. The Mets, to me, need to be holding one of those wild card spots at the All-Star break. Otherwise, if I'm David Stearns, I'm starting to make those phone calls.
So you brought up Francisco Alvarez, his return this week, obviously a huge boost. They've missed him so much. Also, Edwin Diaz expected to be back later this week as well. The Mets, let's just say it, do not have an answer for the 9th inning right now. Hopefully Drew Smith, now that he's back off the IL, will be a high leverage reliever, especially with no Brooks Raley back. They've dealt with a lot of different injuries, but they need their $100 million 9th inning man, Joe, in the absolute worst way.
At this point, I know we've talked about it on the show when he was struggling and, reduce his leverage spots and give others opportunity. But the way the Mets are blowing games in the 9th inning, Edwin Diaz just has to be the closer. And if it doesn't work out, you have to almost just keep going to him and until he figures it out. But he's looked good in his rehab assignments. The velocity is still not that 99, 100. It's a lot of 96 to 98. And, maybe that is something that off the injury, we may not get that 100+ mile an hour velocity out of him this year. Like we've seen him touch 99 a couple times, so far this season. But that was wild throws where it seems like he was trying to throw the heck out of the ball instead of kind of like the easy 99 to 100 that he had in 2022. But certainly the way the bullpen has performed and blown leads of late, we talk about the Mets being 3.5 out of the wild card. If they only blew half of the games that they actually did, the Mets will be holding one of those wild card spots probably. So they certainly need Diaz to come back and not be 2022 Edwin Diaz, but not be the Edwin Diaz that was, for the last month or so of the season.
So I think a big conversation around this team right now that coincides with the big week that they had is that, David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza are clearly living up to there's no complacency here, right? You got to perform to play. And we've seen it now. Jeff McNeil has not been playing a lot. It's been a miserable season for Jeff McNeil. Jose Iglesias was tearing it up in the minors, a veteran second baseman, and he's gotten a shot with the Mets now. And in 7 games, he's hitting over 400 right now. Joe, I know it's a small sample size, but there's no denying that Iglesias is just in a very short time been a significantly more impactful player than what Jeff McNeil was offering the team. And it helps that they hit from opposite sides of the plate where you could get some matchups in play. Shout out to your classic phrase of platoon, Joe. But in all seriousness, what has been your observations of what feels different with this management? It's not just Mendoza, but of course it is Mendoza, but Stearns as well, especially coming off of a year. We've done a lot of podcasts together, and we don't miss many weeks covering this team, whether baseball's going on or it's the offseason. During the Buck Showalter era, something that we raised an eyebrow to and questioned a lot was the reliance on Daniel Vogelback without any production. And it wasn't just Vogelback. It was a lot of different players that were relied on and weren't producing, and the Mets never tried to shake it up. They never gave Mark Vientos a chance during that era. Mark Vientos is having a tremendous season so far. Let's see if he can keep it going. It feels like, and it's not incredible, it's not necessarily going to turn the Mets into a playoff contender, although we're going to see. There is a different feel and a different level of expectations in this era of the Mets, Joe.
You have to set a culture. You have to set up accountability for these players. Look, in previous regimes, Omar Narvaez would still be on this roster, and he would have been starting most of the time because of his salary. Jeff McNeil obviously is making over $12 million a year, and Jose Iglesias is a guy that they call it from AAA. But what it comes down to is the best players got to play, and the player that's performing the most has to play. And I think that's something that, sample sizes matter. Like, I think fans may take this to an extreme where, this time next year, if someone has a bad week and a half to start the season, they're going to be like, what about accountability? I thought these guys have to sit if they're not playing. So there's going to be like a little bit of a gap there. But what it shows to me is David Stearns is able to put his pride and ego to the side and be willing to cut bait on players. It's not been a ton of the guys that he got, obviously, but he's willing to cut bait on a player if they're not performing. And Carlos Mendoza making out the lineup card, he's going to put the best lineup that he can to win that given day. And if that means Jose Iglesias is playing and $12.5 million of Jeff McNeil is sitting on the bench, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. And I think it's a good sign for where the Mets are headed. And I think it's something that, while maybe this season doesn't get the ultimate end result that we're all hoping for, this is setting up for how this organization is going to be run going forward. And that is something I think we can be optimistic about.
And I think I'll take it one step further. I feel like this is just a microcosm of the big picture we should be watching the next 2 months. And that to me is, and I know it might seem a little unfair, kind of zoning in on Pete Alonso right now, but the reality is, unlike Francisco Lindor and Brandon Nimmo, who are on very, very long-term deals that were not negotiated by David Stearns, Pete Alonso is not. And listen, I hope Pete Alonso has a mammoth rest of June, a mammoth July, and that puts the Mets in position that they are a wild card team. We're going to see what happens this year and then carry it on into the offseason for an extension. From a pure baseball perspective right now, Joe, we are halfway through June, and Pete Alonso's OPS is below 800, and it's been trending downwards since his rookie season, where it was 941, where 2021, 863. Okay, 2022, basically the same at 869. Last year, 821. This year, 797 as a 29-year-old first baseman that will be 30 when he signs his free agent contract and is probably going to at least ask for north of $30 million per year, I would think, on a 6 to 8 year deal. Listen, it's just the reality. I love that you said setting the culture, setting expectations. There's a world where Pete Alonso has a great rest of the season, and this isn't a combo. The Mets will give him what he asked for, and Pete Alonso will be a Met for life. But I think, to me, this is a microcosm of Stearns, and of course Mendoza's involved, but this is Stearns' show, that you're not just owed for the future because of your past. I think that's the best way I can put it with how I view how Stearns is going to operate when he has his first real offseason with this team coming out.
And I think that's really fair. When you look at Pete Alonso, obviously, as you mentioned, the stats speak for themselves, and hopefully he has a big month and a half here. I think if he's, a mid 800s OPS guy, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, he's not going to be a guy that gets on base at a 380 clip, so that's going to offset some of the slugging portion of the OPS model. But Pete Alonso has to be better, and if he wants to be resetting the first base market and all these things that he and Scott Boras are mentioning about him, if he wants that, he has to show that. And if he doesn't show it over the next month and change, we have often said on the show, it's not necessarily the Mets go as Pete Alonso goes, but if Pete Alonso's not producing in the middle of that order, it's going to make it very difficult for this team to accomplish what I think they need to over the next month. And then the conversation shifts to the complicated decision of potentially trading Pete Alonso or riding it out because, I think we'll talk about Pete a little bit in the mailbag, but it's almost like, letting your girlfriend date around before you get married. It's not necessarily the best idea. So, especially as a newly married man, I'm sure you would not have appreciated that at one time.
Yeah, that's a no-go for me. So, Hey, listen, it does set a strange precedent and circumstances and kind of changes or potentially changes how negotiations will go, if they'll go at all. All right, let's quickly go down on the farm before we make some new scoreboard predictions, of course, reviewing our old ones. Bryce Montes de Oca begins a rehab assignment. Joe, this has been a long injury road and a return for de Oca, who was one of our favorite players to watch throughout the system because you don't always know where the ball is going, but he has some wild stuff. What are you expecting in his rehab assignment?
Be healthy. Get through it. This guy has been through a myriad of injuries. He's coming back from his second Tommy John surgery. And from everything I heard down in St. Lucie, the rehab went really well. So they're excited to get him back, and he'll be making his first rehab appearance here on Tuesday for Low A St. Lucie. And when we talk about looking ahead to a month and a half from now, we're going to belabor the point of the trade deadline incessantly on this show, probably over the next 6 weeks. But you talked about those relievers earlier, Connor. An Adam Ottavino, a Jake Diekman, a Drew Smith, whoever. Like, if the Mets are going to move on from some of these relievers, you still need to have a bullpen at the major league level. And I think Montes de Oca is someone that, if the rehab goes well, he is someone that could find himself back in a position to get an opportunity in the second half for this bullpen. Because, as you said, it's loud stuff, and I'm excited to see kind of the stat cast behind it. But when he is right, there's up to 101, and there's a couple pitches I've seen that were, I think, 99 with like 22 inches of horizontal run, and it's just like, I don't know how a human being can hit that baseball, but you don't know where it's going, and he is our Rick Vaughn in a way.
And Joe, while we're recording, got our answer on the catcher situation that we just recently discussed. Tomas Nido designated for assignment. Francisco Alvarez, of course, back off the IL with the big league team. Luis Torrens, as it stands right now, Joe, is your backup catcher.
Hey, if you listen to the Mets pod, we gave you the hint 10 minutes ago, and now you're listening.
You already knew the answer.
You already knew, but we didn't, and now we do. So, obviously we talked about it, and Tomas Nido, shout out to him. I mean, from coming from an 8th or 9th round pick to having a sustained run as a backup catcher for the Mets, and had some good moments here. It's just, this is David Stearns' team. This is a new time, and they obviously liked what they saw with Torrens.
Right. I think it just kind of puts the exclamation point or the period at the end of the discussion that we had. If you perform, you'll be rewarded. And I think this is the peak of that so far. And we'll see what happens with Iglesias at second base alongside McNeil as well. Let's review our scoreboard predictions from last week, and we'll make some new ones. Over-under push was set at 1 for Mark Vientos home runs. Joe, we both pushed. He didn't hit one. No points. Over-under push was set at 1. Mets starters going at least 6 innings. Joe, you went over. I pushed. 2 starters went 6 innings. So, Joe, you get the point. Yes or no? Will the Mets beat the Phillies at least once in London? We both said yes. A point awarded to each of us. Who will start more at catcher? Nito, Torrens, even split? We both said split. It was Torrens. No points awarded. And as we saw, he's your backup catcher going forward. We'll see how they ease Alvarez back in as well. So Torrens playing time not going anywhere as it stands right now. Over-under push was set at 2 for Mets wins. Joe, you went over. I went with the push. Point to you, Joe. 3-point week for you, Joe. Just a 1-point week for me. You really reclaim your lead now. 21-18. I had a big week last week. You have a big week this week. The series rolls on. We got 7 games. 3 against the Marlins, 3 against the Padres, 1 against the Rangers before our next podcast. So, Joe, you win the week. You get the floor for over, under, push is set at 2 for Mark Vientos home runs. Keep in mind, as we discussed off camera, the Mets will face at least 2 lefties throughout this stretch.
I will go under. I obviously feel great about what Mark Vientos is doing. And, the home runs are certainly there, but I'll go under.
I'm going to go under as well. I think he definitely hits one in these 7 games. I think 2 is even pushing it. I don't know if they're also going to play him every single game, Joe, as well. He's obviously going to get the 2 lefties. So I'm going to side with you and go under. The next one, sticking with the home runs, over-under push is set at 2 for Pete Alonso home runs. Joe, Pete always performs against the Marlins. I'm actually going to go over here. I think a 3-run home run stretch is coming for Pete throughout this week. What do you think?
I'll push. I think we talked about Pete, and now's the time for him to turn it on. And a 2 home run week isn't so bad, but hey, I hope he hits 5. That would be great.
Over-under push is set at 3 for the Mets starters going at least 6 innings. 7 games, the number's at 3, Joe. What do you got?
I'll push. I think there's certainly guys that are going to go 6. I mean, last week, I think they did it in the first 2 national games, or 2, certainly in the national series, they hit the over. So having the Marlins for 3, the Padres a little underperforming this year, and the Rangers also not quite being the same, I think they'll be able to get the 3.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on this one. 7 games. We know Severino can do it. There's really, it's not a question anymore in the rotation of can these guys do it. It's just getting the good starts, and you have to like the matchups here. That's the most important aspect when looking at it. Over-under push is set at 3 for Jeff McNeil starts. 7 games. We brought up the 2 lefties. This is a really, really tough one, Joe. I think I'm going to sit right at the number of 3. Iglesias should start against both lefties, and I don't think he's going to be totally matchup based. I could see Iglesias getting 4 of the 7 games. I'll go with 3 starts for Jeff McNeil in a push.
I'm going to go over and just kind of flip what you said. I could see McNeil getting 4 of the 7. I don't think it's going to be Iglesias plays the 2 lefty games and Jeff McNeil plays the rest of them, but I don't think they're going to take multiple games away from Jeff against a righty.
Finally, over-under push is set at 4 for Mets wins, Joe. You nailed this one last week. Are you confident again this week?
I'm going to say push. I think 4-3 sounds about right, but if they could go ahead and treat the Marlins the way they treated the Nationals, you could be setting up for one of those 5-2 weeks, which the Mets need a lot more of those type of weeks than the 500 type of weeks.
I'm going to go over here. I think they can get the 5. And there's definitely risk. It's going to be a little different here. I think Alvarez gives them an emotional boost. I think Edwin Diaz will give them an emotional boost as well. I think the Mets know that they are almost playing playoff baseball in June, which is a little scary in terms of the stamina effect. But they almost got to get 5 of 7 here when the schedule lines up like this. Take care of business. Let's take a look at the mailbag questions for the week. We'll start with YouTube. This is Terry Goodmanson, 2060. Biggest Met fan in Canada. Love your podcast. If the Mets end up trading Alonso, why would they only get a top 100 prospect? I would think they can get a solid major leaguer along with the prospect, since Pete could, at least somewhat likely, still contribute offensively for a while longer. Joe, I just think the answer to this has to be team control. If Pete Alonso had even a year left of team control, I could see a world where you maybe get a fringe top 100 prospect and an actual major league player. I think with him being represented by Boris, he's going to the free agent market. He's taking every last dollar. Everybody knows that if Steve Cohen still wants Pete back, he could offer that top dollar and he's gone. If you are contending and Pete's a rental, you cannot trade a major league player because you are taking on a rental to go all in. Tell me where I'm off or anything I missed, Joe.
That's exactly it. I guess the only thing I would add on is right-handed hitting, power, first baseman. Those tend to not do well in the trade market generally. What I will say is one team to keep an eye on for Pete Alonso if this thing goes sideways, the Seattle Mariners. They have trader Jerry Dipoto, who is always ready to work. He
loves it. It's like MLB The Show at his office.
Yeah. Dipoto's that dude in your fantasy league that just incessantly bothers you to trade, and you eventually just trade with him to shut him up. But Seattle looks great. Their pitching's fantastic. They have a black hole at first base, and they need some power. And they have a lot of interesting prospects, some of which are top 100 guys. And I would say if this season goes sideways and the Mets have to sell, I could see Seattle being a team that is heavily interested in Alonso, and I think you might be able to get one of those top 100 guys for him.
Yeah, you're right. Trader Dipoto is just a wild man. I could definitely see it. But yeah, you're right. Also where I think Mets fans just almost need to be prepared for an underwhelming return if they trade Pete. It would tell me if I'm wrong here, Joe. It would probably line up the same as the Scherzer trade because yes, Pete is, well, one, I would think a better acquisition at the time, but the Mets don't have to pay off any of the money. Where I think it would be just one top 100 prospect, right?
I think they'd have to even pay off some of the money to get a top 100 prospect
for this year.
And he's obviously on their control for this year, so there's nothing to pay beyond this year. But he is one of your prime trade chips if the time comes. I think it's him and Luis Severino are probably the two guys that would net you the most. Severino might actually net you more value than Alonso would.
Starting pitcher.
Starting pitching is much more valuable at the deadline. Everybody needs it. Not a ton of teams need right-handed power at first base DH, but if you find all it takes is one. You just need one team that wants the player and you eat some money and maybe you could pull in, one of the Cole Emerson, Cole Young, or Lazaro Montes. Those are three names to keep an eye on for Seattle.
To me, Joe, the Mets' best path, if they are going to go into that mode, and sorry for the people listening that are tired when we bring up the possibility of this. I know there's a big part of this listener base that just wants to talk about the Mets getting back in this thing, and I think we try to balance both worlds the best we can. If they do go into that world, Joe, what do you think of, and it's easier said than done, because not every team puts their foot on the gas pedal like this, packaging your best assets, where it's, hey, you need a pitcher and you need a power bat? Okay, well, you're taking Alonso and Severino, but you're also giving us your top prospect or your second best prospect. Is there any way does that warrant any consideration?
Absolutely. And I think Zach Scott, who was on Baseball Night in New York on Monday, and obviously the former Mets GM, he had talked on his podcast where he was going back to the trade deadline when they traded for Javi Baez. And he said they had conversations with the Cubs about a trade that would have gotten them Baez, Chris Bryant, Contreras, and Trevor Williams. Like
all their good players.
All good players. And obviously didn't work out that way, and they took some players away. But he specifically said about Bryant, he was like, the Cubs basically said what we could offer for Baez and Bryant didn't line up with what they could get separately. So if a team is willing to step up and has the willingness and prospect capital to offset that difference from trading them separately, there's no reason why you can't do, two birds on one stone.
I think why the Mets are a better contender to do that than 95% of teams in baseball is money. Exactly. Yeah. Steve, like most teams can't acquire $15 to $20 million of payroll for the rest of the year. Or they just, I should never say they can't.
They don't want to.
They don't want to. Let's call it what it is. They don't want to. And if Steve Cohen pays that off, well, okay. Yeah, you could have the players and you get them for free, but we also get your farm system.
Yeah,
So
if you're an owner, not to continue down this path too much, we have to move on. But if you're an owner of a contending team, we'll just go back to the Mariners because that's my example right now. If you're the owner of the Mariners and Jerry Dipoto calls you and it's like, we have to give up Lazaro Montes to get Pete Alonso, but the Mets will pay whatever percent of the salary. He's going to say, why wouldn't we do that? But if the call was, we have to give up this player, but we also have to take on, like you said, $11 million, there's going to probably be some pushback.
Yeah, it definitely changes things. All right, more on that later. Next question from Almir Lima Jr. 97. This is also from YouTube. Big International Day on the Mets spot, which is perfect coming off the London series. Hi, guys. Greetings from Sao Paulo, Brazil. I made the trip to New York City this past week and fulfilled a big dream in watching Mets games at Citi Field. I went to 2 games versus the Diamondbacks. I went on the Citi Field tour and got surprised in a bad way by the team museum. So much history to be suppressed in a tiny room. My question to you is, if you guys could choose one moment in Mets history to have a dedicated space in the museum, which one would it be? Thanks. Well, number one, thank you from your listenership all the way from Brazil. Joe and I are even more appreciative of the international listener base that we've accumulated here. It means a lot to us. It's great that you got a trip to Citi Field. Joe, this is not the first time I have heard this about the relocated museum, the location, the lack of space. I'll answer the question after I toss to you, but this is a theme, and I'll say this about Steve Cohen. When something garners this much negative attention, they usually look to fix it in the offseason. And his wife, Alex, who is very, very involved in the stadium aesthetic, really everything involved with the stadium, not just the aesthetic. You've heard this chatter as well, right?
Absolutely. And the museum, it's kind of like spread around. Like some of the plaques are on the top of the escalator at the rotunda, and then some things are in other places. I think if you're going to take a team museum, and as our listener said, like there is, despite not many World Series wins, there's a lot of great Mets moments in history, and it should all be in a consolidated space where you walk into an area and there's everything that you could possibly want to see about Mets history. And when it comes to moments, whether this is commemorated in the museum, commemorated in statue form outside, love the Tom Seaver statue, so I could get on board with more statues. Mike Piazza, home run after 9/11. I think that swing, I think that is something that probably should get a statue, I would say, outside the stadium. And a moment that, even though it didn't work out in the Mets' favor, the Andy Chavez catch in 2006, I think is something that should get more in the museum for that moment, even though you look afterwards and the Mets lost. But that moment, I have shook when Andy Chavez made that catch. And I'll tell you, when that happened, I looked over at my mom. I said, the Mets are going to the World Series. And I think that's exactly what Willie Randolph said that he said. And obviously it didn't work out, but still a classic moment for the Mets.
I think for me, a cool idea that they should consider is, especially like with technology today, it would be really cool if you had a monitor that is just airing the bottom of the 10th inning of the Game 6 1986 World Series, where the Mets come back from the 2-run deficit to ultimately win. I think that, like, with the audio playing in a room. And because here's the thing, it's 2024. I wasn't alive for the 86 World Series. I've read books on it. I've watched it. I've watched documentaries on it. The reality is, and Joe, we're in our 30s, you and I. There are a lot of Met fans that go to Citi Field that have never seen that. They might have seen the ball go through Buckner and moments like that, but I think it's easy to make immersive, walkthroughs that a young fan would be like, wow, this is what it was like on the road to winning a World Series. There's also a lot of ways you can go with that. You could do this 9th inning for Santana's no-hitter, right? Like, the reality is young sports fans, they want to watch everything. They're not going to read as much about it. They want to kind of get the chance to live through it. And I think that's maybe the best way to make a modern museum for all ages, because then the older fans, their parents, would love to relive those moments.
Get to relive them. And what's better than, going to the game with your mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, whatever the case may be. And then they get to tell you where they were when it happened, that kind of stuff. My mom did that forever growing up. She was here when this happened.
Exactly. All right, our last mailbag today. We got 2 from YouTube. Let's take one from Twitter. This is from Jack Bennett. And boy, is this a Joe question. Looking forward to the MLB draft. What direction do you think the Mets go? And what are some things you are hearing about potential targets at 19? Good timing, Joe, because you have, of course, begun to write about the MLB draft for SNY.TV.
Yes, my first mock draft. You could go to SNY.TV and check that out. I posted it on Monday. And what I will tell you is from what I'm hearing, and Connor, you are someone that does a lot of mock drafting yourself for the NFL. When you are a month out from the draft, which is where we're at, information is there, but it's not quite nearly as concrete. But I can't find really anybody with the Mets, outside of the Mets, and just talking about. So for the people outside the Mets, I'm talking about the range of players where the Mets are picking, because obviously they may not have quite the same insight as to what the Mets are specifically thinking. College bat is all I'm hearing, and
Good.
sure if a Trey Yesavage from East Carolina falls down, maybe the Mets consider, and that's a right-handed pitcher from college. Sure, if Bryce Rayner from high school shortstop from California, or Connor Griffin, high school outfielder from Mississippi, I believe. MS is Mississippi, right? Or is that Missouri?
Yes.
Yeah, Mississippi, exactly. So
hopefully I'm
Connor
not
Griffin. Well, whatever. You know what I mean. Sure, if one of those guys fall, I'm sure the Mets would consider it. That's one thing this scouting department has done in the past, is being willing to take a chance when someone falls in their lap, whether that was Kumar Rocker or Kevin Parada, 2 guys that we expect to go higher than the Mets slot. Mets ultimately end up with those players. In my mock draft, I gave them North Carolina outfielder Vance Honeycutt, who, if you watched the Super Regionals, he had a walk-off home run, then led off the next game with a home run, and North Carolina's off to Omaha. He has some swing and miss issues, I would say. He had a strikeout rate over 27% this year for the Tar Heels. And just to put that in some form of context for you, anything above 25% is a red flag. So you're dealing with a potential fatal flaw, in a sense, where if he doesn't make enough contact, he's not going to be able to get to the rest of his tools. But man, the rest of the tools are loud. I think this is a guy with 20/20 potential. He has enough power to be a 20 home run guy. He has plus speed that shows both on the base paths and in the outfield, where he's probably the best defensive outfielder in the class. And he's someone that at number 19 in a draft class that is probably not the strongest class that we've seen in recent years, I think taking a shot on the loud tools and trusting your player development system to fix the fatal flaw just enough. I mean, Nolan McLean, who we had on before, significant strikeout issues at Oklahoma State. Still strikes out, obviously, a lot in pro ball, but that is something that he and the organization are focused on. And I think Honeycutt is a personal favorite of mine in the class just because of the good things he could do, but you're going to have to work through, obviously, a significant flaw.
Yeah, when I read your mock draft, Joe, digging into Honeycutt, I mean, that's the kind of athlete that you want to take when you're not. You obviously always want to draft great athletes, and you want power and you want athleticism, especially in the outfield and on the base paths. But on top of that, the Mets are picking 19th. So this is a philosophy that you've texted me a lot and that you kind of believe in with this team. When you're not picking in the top 10, why not go for ceiling? It feels like when you're drafting in the second half of the first round in the MLB draft, which is very difficult because the wide range of ages with these players, go for the ceiling and see what happens, especially in a system that, to be fair to the Mets, and I like that they're, kind of honing in on college bats here. The Mets have taken tools out of pitchers and kind of crafted them in their own way as prospects, converting relievers to starters and having success with it, where maybe go with the volume approach of pitchers outside of the first round, but feel like you get some big upside offensively with that first round pick.
I think that's probably what they're thinking. And especially in a draft like this, I am generally I'm a little risk averse when I think about player development and drafting. It's just how I look at it. But in a class that if if a guy like Carson Benge is off the board, if a guy like Cam Smith from Florida State is off the board, who am I taking that is this guy that balances floor and ceiling? I don't really see that player. So for me, I'm willing to take a shot. And a couple other names to keep an eye on: Mississippi State outfielder Dakota Jordan, who, I'll be honest, he kind of reminds me, if you remember Elijah Green, who the Nationals took, he reminds me of a college version of Elijah Green, like loud. Everything else is so loud, potentially 70, 80 grade raw power, really big swing and miss problems, which obviously have affected Green in pro ball. And one other name, an ascending player that is someone that wasn't really talked about much, Kentucky outfielder Ryan Waldschmidt. He's a guy that I think is making noise to become a first-round pick. He had a really good year at Kentucky, coming off a tough injury. He was in the Cape Cod League, and he stepped in a hole in the outfield and tore his ACL. So obviously a big injury for Waldschmidt, but he's bounced back in a big way with really good batted ball data and not nearly the strikeout rate that we're talking about with guys like Honeycutt or Jordan. So I'll keep my eye on these college bats. I'm certainly going to be watching the College World Series, but where we stand approximately a month out from the draft, it would be pretty surprising to me if the Mets' first pick wasn't a college bat.
All right, this is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag, as you heard today. Of course, you can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. You'll never be late or miss a show. All right, for Joe, for Connor, we'll catch you next week.